All right, my kiddos, we are going to use the Hardy-Weinberg equation, and we are in lesson 2.12, and I'm on page 4 of lesson 2.12. And if you go to page 4 and you read a little bit and then scroll down, you can see a link here that says using the Hardy-Weinberg equation. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6, maybe 7 different questions here that take you through how to use all of Hardy-Weinberg. So that is what I'm going to show you how to do. I'm not going to go through each one and then like do them separately. I'm just going to take you through Hardy-Weinberg all the way through to the end of this. I would beg of you, though, if you have not read through lesson 2.12 yet carefully, I would pause this video and do that first. You need to do the reading before you hear what I have to say here in the video. So if you haven't read lesson 2.12, please do go through it, read it carefully. Try the practice problems on your own first. That way you can see how well you're doing with it. All right, so here we go. What we are going to do is use the Hardy-Weinberg equation to calculate the frequency of homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive individuals in a population. And in order to do that, the first thing you have to do is count up how many, bear with me, I'm learning how to use this drawing program too, so if I mess up, I'm sorry. First thing you have to do is count up how many homozygous recessive individuals there are. But before we do that, let's do a little review of some vocabulary. Homozygous recessive, if you recall, would be a genotype with 2 lowercase letters. And in this case of the fruit doves, we're going to use 2 lowercase f's to indicate homozygous recessive. Now, if you remember, in our fruit doves from our fictitious island, the recessive allele gives or codes for green head feathers, right? So homozygous recessive, homo means same, recessive means we're looking at the recessive allele, which is represented by the lowercase letter. And in this case, the recessive allele is for green feathers. Now, the other term that we have to discuss is homozygous dominant. Homozygous dominant. Homozygous means the same allele. Dominant means the capital letter. So we're going to have 2 of the same alleles, both of them dominant, both of them capital. And if you remember, our homozygous dominant, or the dominant allele codes for purple feathers. Okay, and then there's one more vocabulary term, heterozygous. Make sure I'm spelling that right. Heterozygous, and that just means different. So you're going to have 2 different alleles, meaning for us, 1 capital and 1 lowercase. Now these birdies, this individual birdie, pretend you're a bird, you would have purple feathers, right? Because that dominant allele right there always wins. All right, it's going to trump the lowercase recessive allele. So this bird, although it carries the gene for green feathers, it doesn't actually have green feathers on its head because it also has the gene, the dominant gene for purple feathers. Okay, with that said, let's first count up how many homozygous recessive individuals are in this bird population. And there are 20 birds in this bird population, I promise you. But we're just going to count the green feathered ones. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 out of 20 birds have green feathers, which means 5 out of 20 birds are homozygous recessive for green feathers. They have this lowercase f genotype. Their phenotype is that they have green feathers. So if we do this math, 5 divided by 20, I promise you, if you grab your calculator, and I'll grab mine just to show you that I use my calculator too, 5 divided by 20 is 0.25. Now I know that some of you can do math like this in your head. It's not always going to be this easy of a calculation. I don't mind if you use a calculator. You should be using a calculator at this point in biology, and eventually when you take chemistry. You don't have to do this math in your head. So 5 divided by 20 is equal to 0.25. What's interesting is that is also equal to q squared. And if you recall, our Hardy-Weinberg equation looks like this. P squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. That's the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So what we have essentially done here in these first few moments is calculated q squared. So here's q squared, and it is equal to 0.25. The other interesting thing you can do is you can turn that into a percentage. 5 divided by 20 is 0.25. If I multiply that by 100 to get a percentage, it's equal to 25%. So what we're saying here is that 25% of the population of these birds, right, is going to be homozygous recessive for green feathers. And while what's really cool about Hardy-Weinberg is you can use that math, this calculation, and apply it to a population of not just 20 birds. You can apply it to a population of 10,000 birds of these birds. And if the alleles are unchanging, if the frequency is unchanging, and the population is at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, then you can guess that 25% of the birds are going to be homozygous recessive, showing green feathers. Okay, so now that we have Q, right, but we don't have anything else. We haven't figured out P squared. We haven't figured out 2PQ, but we do have Q squared, which is a good thing. Okay, we initially counted up our birds, our recessive birds. There were 5 of them out of the whole 20 birds. You do that math, that's 0.25. That's the frequency, Q squared, of the homozygous recessive individuals. Well, now that I know Q squared, if Q squared equals 0.25, I can then calculate Q, can't I? Right? If I have Q squared and I want to figure out what Q is, I just take the square root of both sides, right? So the square root of Q squared and the square root of 0.25, and I'm going to do that on my calculator because I don't want to mess it up. The square root of 0.25 is 0.5. So now I not only have Q squared, which is 0.25, I now know Q, which is 0.5. All right, what am I going to do with that? Well, this is Q squared, 0.25. But over here, in this part of the equation, I have to enter just Q. Well, now I know what Q is. It's 0.5, so I can plug 0.5 in here for Q. But none of that is going to do me any good if I don't know what P is, right? I haven't figured out P yet. Well, that's not hard to do. Watch this. If you recall what we did on Wednesday, P plus Q equals 1. I just figured out what Q is, didn't I? So P plus 0.5 equals 1. Now I know that P also equals 0.5, right? Because they have to add up to 1. So this would have to be 0.5 plus 0.5. So a half plus a half equals a whole, right? So 0.5 plus 0.5 equals 1. So now I know P is 0.5. So I know Q squared, here let me change the colors here. I know Q squared is 0.25. I'm not going to write anything because it's just going to get messy. But I know that q squared is 0.25. That would go there. I calculated q as 0.5, so I could plug that in here. I just calculated p also as 0.5, so I could plug that in there, and I can figure out p squared, right? If p is equal to 0.5, p squared is equal to 0.5 times 0.5. Let's use our calculator. So p squared is equal to 0.25, and I could plug that in right here. Yay! I'm going to move this up a little bit so we have some room. Okay, so what do we know? Let's rewrite all of this. We know that p squared equals 0.25. I'm also going to tell you that p squared is equal to the frequency, I'm going to abbreviate frequency, equal to the frequency of the homozygous dominant individuals. Okay, so p squared is equal to the frequency of the homozygous dominant individuals. Those would be our capital F individuals, right? They would have purple feathers. Okay, now if I want to, I can turn 0.25 into a percentage, and that would be 25%. So I know that 25% of the individuals in this fruit dove population are probably going to have this genotype, which is going to code for purple feathers. So there we go. I can also now calculate 2pq. That's the middle part of the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So let's plug in what I know. I have 2 times p, here's p, 0.5, times q, and I had q up here somewhere, there it is, also 0.5, and they're not always going to be the same. And if I do that math, I get 2, and I'm using my calculator, times 0.5 times 0.5, and I get 2 times 0.5 times 0.5 equals 0.5. All right, so what is that telling me? Let's turn that into a percentage. I'd multiply it by 100 to turn it into a percentage. That means that 50% of the population of these birds is going to be heterozygous. That middle variable, this middle part of the equation, the 2pq, calculates the frequency of heterozygous individuals. And remember, heterozygous individuals have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. But also, they're going to be what color? Purple. So here's my second bit of information from Hardy-Weinberg. And then the third part we already talked about at the beginning, but we're going to put it down here again just to keep everything in one place. Remember, q squared was 0.25. Right here, we had q squared up here. Q squared is 0.25, which equals 25%. And remember, q squared gives you the frequency of the homozygous recessive individuals. And so they're going to have the lowercase f genotype, which means that they're going to have green feathers. So what did we just calculate? We figured out if you have a population of these birds, 25% of them are probably going to have green feathers, and 75% of them are going to have purple feathers, right? Because 50% plus 25% is 75. But not only did you figure out the percentage of, like, the frequency of the color, you also figured out the frequency of the genotypes. 25% of the birds are probably going to be homozygous dominant. 50% of the birds are probably going to be heterozygous. And then 25% of the birds are probably going to be homozygous recessive.